Don't let the September blues get you down. Enhance your everyday with our terrific sponsor, Via Hemp.
Via Hemp is all about crafting award-winning THC and THC-free gummies.
We love this company because they grow their premium hemp right here on American farms. Their products come at such a great value, especially for Murdersheet listeners 21 and older, who get 15% off their first order with our exclusive code MSHEET. Just go to viahemp.com, that's VIIAHEMP.com. When you support our sponsors, you're supporting us.
No matter what you're looking for, they've got something delicious and cool for you.
See, Via's gummies were each created to elicit a specific mood. Boost your pleasure, get some shut-eye, harness your creativity, experiment with microdosing. Whatever you want to do, Via has a THC or THC-free gummy for you.
And it's also accessible. No medical card is required. The gummies ship legally to all 50 states.
I love their grapefruit CBG and CBD flow state gummy because they help me really channel all my energy into getting productive and efficient.
Well, no matter what mood you're seeking, we strongly recommend Via.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use code MSHEET to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSHEET at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
Achieving a gorgeous grin from home isn't a total mystery with Bite Clear aligners. Just don't be surprised if all of your sleuthing friends start asking, "What's your secret?" Begin by ordering your at-home impression kit today for only $14.95. Bite Clear aligners are doctor-directed and delivered to your door. Treatment costs thousands less than braces. Plus, they offer flexible financing, accept eligible insurance, and you can pay with your HSA FSA. Get 80% off your impression kit when you use code WONDERY at Byte.com. That's BYTE.com. Start your confidence journey today with Byte.
What makes a life a good one? Is it the adventure you have? Or the friends you find along the way? Maybe it's pursuing your passion while striving to protect, defend, and save what you believe in every single day. So, what makes a life a good one? In the Coast Guard, we think it's all of the above and more, but you'll have to find out for yourself. Visit gocoastguard.com to learn more.
Content warning, this episode contains discussion of the murder of 2 girls.
So this is day 2 of the 3 days of hearings, pretrial hearings in the Richard Allen case. This is, of course, also known as the Delphi murders case. And you, of course, Anya and I went. We were there bright and early at 5 a.m. and we were there until the close of the session, which I think was around, 6:30-ish?
Correct.
Long day.
Yes.
Now, usually what we do is we just keep it simple. We just start at the beginning and work our way through the entire day in chronological order. We're going to do things a little bit differently today because, frankly, I think roughly 90 to 95% of the stuff you'll be talking about tomorrow was in the last witness of the day, and maybe 0% of what you'll be talking about tomorrow was in the first witness.
Yes.
So it doesn't really make sense to start there. So we're going to start with the last witness and then do the other 2 afternoon witnesses. And then we'll jump back and do the morning because, of course, we're all about the details, even the ones that aren't super interesting.
It's the minutia sheet for you.
Yes, but we are going to start with the last witness of the day. So stay tuned.
My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
And this is The Murder Sheet.
We're a true crime podcast focused on original reporting, interviews, and deep dives into murder cases. We're The Murder Sheet.
And this is The Delphi Murders, 3 days of pretrial hearings, day 2. Oh my goodness. Okay. Wow. I mean, like literally, I felt like in the last testimony from the last witness, Detective Brian Harshman, the people observing, some people had already left at that point, and I feel bad for them because the stuff that was mentioned here really gets into actual details of the crime, and not only the crime, but frankly, the investigation into Richard Allen, who's accused of murdering these kids.
Absolutely devastating for the defense. Absolutely devastating for the defense. This witness was presented by Stacy Diener, who did a masterful job with it. And I should also mention that prosecutor Nick McClelland also works with a gentleman named James Luttrell, who did a splendid job yesterday.
Yes, he does. Yeah. This is a very strong prosecution team. And this
very
was
strong prosecution team led by Nick McClelland, who also does fine work. So this witness was presented by, as I say, Stacy Diener. You may not have heard the name Brian Harshman.
Yes, right.
The testimony opened by talking a little bit about his background. Do you want me to cover that, or do you want to?
I can cover it. So he's been with the Indiana State Police for 30 years, or he will have been with them for 3 decades on December 4th of this year. And 17 of those years were spent as a detective. So he's been doing a lot of work. In the early part of 2020, he was assigned to the U.S. Marshals Task Force. And in addition to looking into fugitives, part of the work he also did was also on Delphi starting in 2020. As he described it, he kept on asking now Lieutenant Jerry Holman to put him on the Delphi case. Eventually, Holman relented, and he's been working on that. So the reason he's relevant today is because he is the detective who is largely in charge of going through the different audio and video recordings of basically Richard Allen in prison.
He described himself, I think, at one point as the caretaker of the phone calls. So this is the guy who is listening in on the recordings of every phone call that Richard Allen makes. And in addition to that, he is watching the video that is being taken of Richard Allen in his cell. There's a camera in the cell 24 hours a day. He's watching that. He is watching footage of whenever Richard Allen is moved from one location to another location within the prison, that is videotaped. And so Detective Harshman is watching all of that. He is watching everything. And he's hearing the phone calls. And in these phone calls, he gets to hear Richard Allen talk about his perspective on things. And also, in addition to that, of course, Detective Harshman gets to see how the guards treat Richard Allen as they're transporting him from one location to another. And he says that in his view, their professionalism and the way they treat him is over the top. But he also goes on to say, of course, we should keep in mind that these officers are not stupid and they know they're being recorded. So, of course, you would expect them to be on their best behavior.
Harshman was very blunt in a lot of his delivery, but I think it was also very compelling because it wasn't really sugarcoating things, but it just was kind of a frank assessment of what was going on.
In addition to that, he's also been reviewing the companion door sheets. So the companions is the name given to other inmates originally, and then I believe it was guards who took over the role.
Yes.
These are people who basically stand outside the cell. They keep an eye on Richard Allen to make sure he doesn't harm himself. And then on these door sheets, they record anything of interest. So some of these door sheets end up containing some confessions. And as I say, he also is the caretaker of the call. So he's reviewed all of the calls. And he said he's reviewed a total of somewhere between 650 and 670 calls made by Richard Allen for a total of somewhere between 150 to 170 hours. So just the sheer magnitude of the amount of material this man has had to consume is immense.
So he was able to identify some patterns regarding Richard Allen. Should we talk about that, or what do you want to do? I mean, I don't even know where to start with this.
I think he started with the pattern.
Yeah.
What happened to Richard Allen in March of 2023, right before he started making all these confessions?
So right before Allen started making all these confessions on March 21st, 2023, that exact date is what he brought up. That is the date that Richard Allen, at least for the time being, found Jesus Christ and God and he became concerned, and this revealed itself over the course of the calls and over the course of video recordings of his transport to and from different medical appointments and to and from other facilities, because the prison staff films that on a camcorder for legal reasons, it sounds like. And after that, religious revival, he became very concerned about going to heaven. He wanted to go to heaven with his family once he dies.
Because he says he recognizes that his circumstances are such that he may never be with his family, living with his family again in this lifetime. But he wants to be with them in heaven. And to be clear,
in his intake, it was revealed that he described himself as not a religious person when he was first arrested.
But reading the Bible in prison
changed that.
So if he wants to go to heaven to be reunited with his family, he has to make things right. And Richard Allen has conceded in these phone calls that he's not sure that after what he's done, he can even get into heaven.
Yes.
But the confession started around this time because it was an effort to make things right so he could go to heaven to be with his family. And Detective Harshman said there are a number of different types of confessions or incriminating statements.
Yes.
But he says the number of actual direct confessions from Richard Allen to this crime are over 60.
And that is a conservative estimate by his count.
And some of these confessions are specific. And I have it here in my note that he mentions that some of them contain details of the crime that only the killer would know.
Yes, he talks about the crime very specifically. So not only is he saying, I did this specific crime, but he has details that nobody else should know.
Yes.
This is devastating. This is, when I was listening to him say this, my mouth was hanging open. I think I was just, you have to understand, it comes at the end of a very long day. I was kind of like, this is it. We're going to be going home soon. And he comes out with this, and I was shocked.
And if Anya reacted this way, you must be wondering, how did Richard Allen's mother and wife react?
Yeah.
And according to Detective Harshman, who again has heard all of these recordings.
When you mean not in the courtroom, you mean when he was first calling them to make these confessions after he found Jesus.
After he found Jesus and he called them, they were extremely upset. His mom was saying things like, they're messing with you. They're messing with your mind. His wife, Kathy, said, stop talking. I'm going to call Brad. And then hung up the phone herself, presumably to call Brad Rosie, who, of course, is one of Richard Allen's defense attorneys. As time went on, and he would continue in his conversations with them to bring up the fact that he was actually guilty of the crimes which he had been charged with, they would just try to change the subject.
Yes. They would essentially say, you don't know what you're saying, use the same excuses. Although Harshman noted that there were sort of religious discussions between the three and indicated that the family as a whole is quite religious. So that's somewhat interesting.
Richard Allen in these calls indicates that he delayed confessing because he was worried by how his family would react. And in fact, there apparently were periods of time, even extended periods, where he went without communicating with his family at all. And Detective Harshman indicated that Richard Allen repeatedly expressed some concern over whether his family will still love him no matter what happens in the trial.
So the tenor of some of these conversations was Richard Allen essentially asking again and again, would you still love me? Will you still be there even if I did this? Do you still love me? Can you say you love me? Begging for their love despite what he says he did to these two children.
And also, we just said he finds Jesus in March of 2023 and then begins making these confessions. But there were other interesting things that he said prior to that. Let's go all the way back to the second week of November of 2022. This is not that long after Richard Allen has been arrested and charged with these murders. And at this time, he tells Kathy Allen, if all of this becomes too much for you, just tell me, and I will talk to the detectives and tell them what they want to know. So I guess that...
not that. The actual quote, if this becomes too much for you, I'll talk to the detectives and tell them everything I know.
Yes.
Not what they want to hear, what I know.
What I know. So this would fall into the category of we hear some things are confessions, we hear some things are incriminating statements. I think that would qualify not as a confession, but as an incriminating statement.
Correct. Yes, that's not saying I killed Libby and Abby. That is saying that's strongly indicating that you killed Libby and Abby.
Richard Allen in phone calls also expressed concern about how his family would react when they would see what he had done, namely how they would react once they saw the crime scene photos.
Yes, at trial. He did not, this is what Harshman said, he did not want them to see what he had done to the girls.
He also indicated, once his family started reacting very, very negatively to all of this, the confessions slowed down.
They, in fact, did not necessarily indicate that they loved him no matter what. They, in fact, stopped communicating with him at times and would tell him that he was either wrong or out of his head and that they didn't want to hear it. So after he's rejected by his family, essentially, he goes from confessing a lot from April of 23 to June/early July of 23 to slowing down. But he did not entirely stop. Concerning statements continued to pop out of his mouth. So in January of 2024, in a conversation with his mother, Janice Allen, he indicated that he wanted to tell the truth, but he didn't want to hurt his family. Then February of 2024, he indicated to a corrections guard, I believe that would have been, was that after he moved to Wabash Valley?
I believe so.
So this is not in Westville, this is his new prison. He indicated to a corrections guard and apologized for killing Libby and Abby. So these statements did not stop entirely, but they were mostly congested around that moment where he thought that maybe he could unburden himself after finding God.
And go to heaven.
And go to heaven with his family and perhaps do the right thing as a Christian. And as his family continued to indicate that that is not what they wanted to hear, he stopped for the most part, but not entirely.
Then the whole point of all this testimony was because the defense was trying to get these confessions thrown out. We'll talk about that more a little bit later. And one of their arguments was that these confessions basically shouldn't count because Richard Allen had somehow been coerced or induced into making these statements. And so it is very worthwhile to note that Detective Harshman, who of course has seen all this video, listened to all this audio, said he never has seen in any of that any indication that Richard Allen had been coerced or induced to make any confession whatsoever.
Yes. Now, Harshman did indicate that Richard Allen feels like he's been tortured, and he also got into what he means by that, and he indicated that it was mental torture.
Not psychological, not physical torture.
Not physical torture, but he feels like the fact that it is very loud in the unit where he is, that the other prisoners make noise, that is a form of psychological torture, and that the lights are, in his view, on all the time and it's hard to sleep is physical torture, or is psychological torture. And to be clear, those are things that in certain settings can be psychological torture, but it's interesting because it's not entirely clear to me from other testimony whether the light issue is even an issue, because some people indicated that they felt that the inmates had control over the lights in their cells. But as for the noise, it is pretty well known that a lot of prisons can be loud places, and that can be stressful for people to hear that.
Harshman also has spoken with the guards who work with Richard Allen These guards, it's worth noting, have not received, psychological training or any of that.
Yes, Brad Rosie made sure to object a lot over this point to clarify that these are guards and not psychologists.
But these guards, by and large, believe that Richard Allen was faking his extreme behavior, or Brian Harshman called Richard Allen's behavior Richard Allen's antics. He said that Harshman said he talked to 10 officers or door companions, and roughly 8 out of 10 of them thought that Richard Allen was faking.
Yes, 8 out of 10 guards say he's malingering. So these, yeah. Oh, man.
I guess next in my notes, I have Brad Rosie's cross-examination.
Yes, Rosie attempted to turn things around with a cross-examination. And we're going to talk, I'm going to praise Rosie a little bit for this today, later on. But
in fairness to Rosie,
it's hard to cross this. It really is.
There really wasn't much to do. He just kind of said, "Oh, so you're listening to all of his phone calls. I guess Richard Allen, who of course is incarcerated, I guess he has no privacy."
It's like,
and Harshman said, "Yeah, he doesn't have any privacy.
He doesn't have any privacy. He's in prison. And also, if he was in jail, we would also be listening to his phone calls. That's just kind of how it works." And so I thought it was really interesting that he kind of just basically resorted to what was sort of a pretty ineffective tactic of repeat the facts, but in a disapproving tone. Like Kevin's like, "We have ice cream today. We have ice cream today." It's like, okay, that didn't work.
And he was like, "Oh, so the camera's on him in the cell 24 hours a day. I guess you could even see him going to the bathroom." And Harshman said, "Well, I don't enjoy it, but yeah, I can see it."
Yes. And also the one big thing that Brad Rosie kept asking is like, "Well, has this ever happened before to anyone?" And the answer is yes. But has it ever happened to a pretrial detainee, specifically
in solitary
confinement,
Westville,
named Richard Allen from the town of Delphi, Indiana? And the answer is no. But the answer is, yeah, this actually does happen. And also we found out more about pretrial stuff. We'll talk about that later. It's not as important as this.
I think this testimony is game changing.
Yeah, this really and Rosie tried to pull out the well, were any of the guards that you knew interviewed wearing patches that say "I hate people" or having Odinist symbols? Harshman indicated no. These are other prison guards. And, that's not really an issue here. So, yeah.
So, again, the motion under discussion today was whether or not these confessions can be admitted.
Oh, can I just say one thing that
Yes.
Rosie tried to go with? At one point, when talking about how in November of 2022, Allen basically offered to his wife that he'd tell detectives everything he knew if that would make her feel better. And Rosie indicated that was just taking a chivalrous approach with his wife. Confessing to murder.
Yeah, Anya finds nothing more romantic than if I offer to make a false confession of murder.
Yes, as if that, and I just thought Harshman at one point was just very bluntly well, that's your assumption.
Yeah.
It was just, it was really hard. It was really hard to spin when confronted with this sheer amount of evidence from Allen's own mouth, and to hear the diversity of it, and the fact that we knew that Allen's one of his statements with his wife and mother were recorded, but it sounds like there's a lot more audio and video than anyone knew.
Over 100 hours. Before we talk about the other two afternoon witnesses, which were Jerry Holman and Dr. Monica Wawa, I want to quickly note that when we all came back from lunch, we were a little surprised to see that Andrew Baldwin was not in court. In fact, he was not there for the afternoon session. Not entirely clear why. Brad Rosie told the judge at one point that Baldwin had some professional commitments elsewhere. Some people were like, "Oh, why would Baldwin leave in the middle? That isn't that awful?"
And that person was me.
But the fact of the matter is, it's not a big deal when you're working on a team like this and the ball is being carried by someone else, being carried by Brad Rosie. If Andrew Baldwin did have another professional commitment elsewhere, it's no big deal for him to go and fulfill it, because had he been there, he probably would have just been a spectator watching Brad Rosie handle it.
That
Because
makes sense.
Brad Rosie actually did handle all of the witnesses and such this afternoon.
It makes sense, and I feel bad. My initial reaction was literally like, what the heck? Does he have a date somewhere? But what Kevin said made a lot of sense, and sometimes something that can seem unusual to an outsider, when you actually talk to people on the inside, it's like, oh, okay, that actually does make sense. So I withdraw my earlier shock and awe.
Well, thank you for that. So now that we've finished that, why don't we go... Oh, Anya is making the signal that she has a rare in-episode correction to make.
This is actually a really sad and upsetting one, to be honest, because I realized looking at my notes and just thinking about it, I earlier said that in a statement referenced by Detective Harshman that Alan indicated that he was sorry for killing Abby and Libby, but looking at this, it actually just said Abby. So it was not for both girls. His sorriness or his apology was not for both girls. It was just for Abby. And so I imagine that, given that Libby's family was here today, that was very upsetting to hear. And so I apologize for the error. I just wanted to throw that out there because I guess I just assumed it was both girls, but looking at my notes, it only says Abby.
Right. So with that said, the first witness after lunch, maybe we're doing this in a strange order. First witness after lunch was Jerry Holman. And again, the issue being discussed today was whether or not the confessions are going to be allowed into the trial. And in order to argue that they should be thrown out, the defense was trying to claim that they were coerced or induced. And Jerry Holman is one of the leaders of the investigation and also has a familiarity with the circumstances, so to speak, of Alan's detention. And so he was called by the defense, actually. And so he indicated, yes, I'm familiar with the detention. Brian Harshman has been monitoring Richard Allen's phone calls. And of course, we would hear more about that later. And Holman indicated that once they started to receive the information about Richard Allen making the confessions, they tried to get more information, including some of the videotapes. And then one thing I thought was interesting and worth pointing out is that Brad Rosie, they say you shouldn't ask a question that you don't know the answer to. And Brad Rosie said, well, did you ever you heard these so-called confessions. Did you ever try to follow up on any of the information that was in them? And Holman said, well, yes, and I can give you an example. And this example is a little bit upsetting. He said that in one of these confessions, Richard Allen actually identified the murder weapon. He indicated that the murder weapon was a box cutter he had been issued at CVS, and that after the murder, he had thrown it into a dumpster there. And so Lieutenant Holman went to CVS, confirmed they did indeed use box cutters, but of course, all these years later, any box cutter that was thrown in the dumpster in 2017 is long gone.
Yeah, that was really shocking to hear after so long, where people have wondered, just before we even knew how the girls died, what the murder weapon was. Then when we found out that that they had been killed with a sharp-edged weapon, what happened to that? How was it possibly disposed of? Was it thrown in a river somewhere? Was it, buried somewhere? And what Alan apparently has said is that it was a box cutter. It was a work box cutter from CVS, and that he disposed of it, as Kevin said, in the dumpster outside of his work. And other angles that kind of were a little bit less perhaps grabbing but intrigued me were talking to, I guess, friends of his daughter in the past, other avenues based on things that he has said in prison, confessions and incriminating statements that he has made. They have tried to interview friends of Alan's own daughter. And in addition to that, one thing you may be wondering, just around the kind of, well, if they're listening in all his calls, what
I was about
mean?
to mention this.
Yes, I think this was really important to clarify because One thing as the wife of a lawyer, I guess that doesn't really qualify me to talk about anything, but it's just something I was like, I'm wondering, I know Kevin's thinking this. Are they recording his calls with his lawyers? Because that would obviously be a huge breach. And apparently the way this system that they have set up, I think it was called, GTL, is that I guess certain numbers are plugged in and those are listed as attorneys' numbers, and those are not recorded. No one can listen to those. Those are not picked up by the system. Those are completely private.
I'll admit, hearing that confirmed and brought out made me feel better.
Yeah, I was just like, oh, that seems kind of like that would be risky because, like, are we just trusting them to delete it? But those are actually just never recorded in the first place. So I felt like that was important to state. Additionally, one thing that I think, I don't know if you mentioned this already, Kevin, so I apologize if I'm being repetitive, but it says when the calls are being recorded, when on both the inmate side and whoever's calling them, the family members say, there's a sort of pre-recorded message saying this call is being recorded. It's not a surprise later on. That's what it says.
Yeah, they're not hiding the ball.
No, it's very clearly with jail. This is often the case too, where there's no expectation of privacy when you're oftentimes jailhouse calls make it into the record when it comes to different cases because there's not that expectation of privacy that you would have if you were a private citizen at home, not incarcerated.
And so it's always surprising when you hear, as you so often do, the people incarcerated making incriminating statements or confessions over phone calls that they know are being recorded.
Well, in this case, it sounds like he wanted to confess because he found God, thought it was the right thing to do, and wanted to be certain that his wife and mother, two of the most important people in the world to him from the sounds of it, still loved him at the end of the day. And he did not get that. He did not get what he wanted. But it was not some sort of mistake where he just slipped up and said, oops, oh no, now I admitted it. This was an attempt to gain some kind of acceptance by saying, here is what I have done. Please love me anyway. And he was told, you're wrong. You're being brainwashed and manipulated. Get off the phone. We need to call your lawyer. He was met with a brick wall.
Yes. Was there anything else you wanted to highlight from Lieutenant Holman's?
Holman, like Harshman, I thought the state police had a good day on the stand today. Just when I look at this sometimes strategically, I think, like, how does this witness come across? He and Harshman came across very well, just kind of very matter of fact. So that was something. When you see a witness struggling, as we may talk about in a moment, then, it kind of underscores, both for the defense and the prosecution, what does a good witness look like? What's important? Can this person be persuasive to a jury? It's definitely notable that the defense has especially taken a lot of swings at Holman in an effort to undermine his credibility. But I guess I still think I don't know if they've really landed that much on him.
I think the witness you alluded to is our next witness, Dr. Monica Wawa. This is the psychologist who works at Westville and who treated Richard Allen. And as we will hear, as we've heard before, she was the recipient of some incriminating statements and confessions from Richard Allen, called by the defense. And I'll say it's quite a wild ride because
yes, thank you.
Because there are times when Brad Rosie is acting like Dr. Wawa is his best friend, and there's times when he's acting like Dr. Wawa is a disgrace to the profession.
I'll give Rosie this. And I actually thought if the hearing had ended earlier, I would probably give today's win to Rosie. I would say he did the best job out of anyone here. I'll explain why that ended up not happening later, but I think he had the closest thing they've had in a while to the kind of Perry Mason moment. What I mean by that is, of course, Perry Mason is a work of fiction, but oftentimes, he's very much a pillar for people who, follow. Everyone expects a Perry Mason moment where it's like something dramatic to happen on the stand, or Perry Mason turns around and says, no, you're lying. And then the person's like, yeah, you're right, I did it. So that obviously didn't happen. But this had a lot of drama. It had the ups and downs. It was very theatrical.
He had a lot of shaky moments, as I'm sure we'll discuss.
Oh, yes.
And then he went and there was a break. And after the break, he came back, and Rosie did a fine job after that with his one witness.
Yes. But let's talk about the where it maybe started so we can understand where it went.
You take us away.
I'm going to take you. Yeah. So Dr. Wawa is a Westville psychologist. We already knew that from some of the filings. And she was brought on. She's had a number of years of experience. And she was essentially, she actually has worked there since 2017 and has been working with Richard Allen during his incarceration. So from the beginning, she described it. With the beginning of her testimony, she was essentially there to give us a sense of Richard Allen's mental state throughout his stay at Westville.
And she also gave some interesting details about what is it like to receive mental health care at Westville. And some of these details were quite interesting to me. You would often get a chance to visit with your patients, be they Richard Allen or someone else, in their cell during what she called rounds. And you would try to speak to prisoners in this particular unit at the front of their cell at least twice a week. But that is not a face-to-face meeting because there is a metal door. It's not like bars, it's a metal door to the cell, and that's not open. So you really can only see them maybe a little bit through a crack in the door, which I think is used to deliver things like
food.
And so then basically in these rounds, sometimes your visit with the prisoner you're treating only lasts a few seconds or a few minutes. You ask them how they're doing. You ask if they're thinking of doing self-harm, because one of the big issues in mental health in prison, as we heard today, was it is very important to know if the prisoner is thinking of harming themselves.
Yes, indeed. And so with Dr. Wallace, she described how when he came into the prison, he was immediately on suicide watch. This was because he was deemed at a special risk due to being diagnosed with issues around depression. And the fact that
I think he was actually put on suicide watch even before he arrived.
He actually was. No, you're right. You're right. I misstated that. At the diagnostic sort of reception center where they essentially process all of the prisoners, he came into them essentially stamped with this suicide watch thing. And so they took orders from that initial treatment facility that was essentially just there to say, here's what you're getting. And they went with that in terms of the suicide watch. And that means that as somebody who is on sort of in a restricted housing section, as he was in Westville, he had a lot of restrictions. They're basically trying to make sure that he does not die by suicide. And what goes on from here is things like he has to wear sort of a suicide smock that Brad Rosie at one point described as a caveman outfit.
And he also very interestingly said, maybe a little bit grossly said, that when you're wearing one of these caveman garments, one of these suicide smocks, it's a detriment to going out and enjoying some vigorous recreation because your genitals can be easily exposed
Correct.
to view. And that led to some detour where he was asking Dr. Wawa a bunch of questions about recreation time. And then Stacey Diener, the prosecutor, I think she spoke for a lot of people in the courtroom at this point, where she objected and said, wait a minute, this is a psychologist. Why are we talking about rec time?
Yeah, she's not his gym coach.
And so Rosie moved on.
Yes. There was a lot of detours, to be honest. The Dr. Wallace section of this whole thing felt like it lasted 2 days. If I'm being honest, that's just my personal opinion, obviously.
My opinion is that it felt like it lasted 2 months.
Yeah, it was really rough. And, but essentially at some point, Alan was off suicide watch. He was doing better. He was exercising in his cell. He was having a better outlook on his situation. A lot of people have a lot of trouble adjusting to a prison environment, as you can imagine, especially one as drastic as this, because let's not forget, he's in their maximum security unit. He's very isolated by this whole thing.
He had a window in his cell, though, but the window was scratched up so he couldn't see outside. And so Dr. Waller arranged for him to get a replacement window. So now he can look out and see a barbed wire fence. Rosie mentioned that when Richard Allen was in his cell, he was fighting with bugs. That was the phrase he used.
That was an odd phrase.
That was an odd phrase. And they also mentioned something about mice in the cell. And then he kind of like looked off camera or whatever and said, well, those sorts of things can make a guy go crazy.
That was really corny. I don't know why he did that.
Because obviously he wants us to think that it drove Richard Allen crazy. And then Dr. Waller replied by saying, well, that depends on what you mean by crazy.
She really didn't like many mental health professionals, she really did not like someone using the word crazy in such a casual way. It's seen as very derogatory. You don't have a lot of mental health professionals who are going to agree, yeah, that's totally crazy, man. Because, I mean, they know firsthand the stigma that people with mental health issues can face.
She talked about other inmates yelling at Richard Allen to kill himself. Calling him baby killer.
Calling him for to commit suicide and yelling insults, although she did not mention anything about anyone yelling, I'm going to kill you, which kind of came up later. She also talked about some of his own mental health issues and so
physical health issues.
And physical health issues. So heart problems. He has to take medication for his heart. In addition to that, generalized anxiety disorder. That's a level of anxiety that some people face that's more extreme and can disrupt your daily life. In addition to that, I believe it was a major depressive disorder.
Which she indicated goes back to early adulthood, and she indicated he was hospitalized for this for over a week back in 2019.
Yes, that's significant. For years, we've heard rumors that at some time, Allen went into either a rehab or some sort of mental health facility after the murders in order to, deal with whatever he had to deal with. And so this confirms that something like that happened in 2019. And one thing that also I thought was interesting, she said that there were signs of something specific, but she didn't confirm it. She didn't diagnose him. That was not her job. It was just more of like looking at things that maybe indicated that he had an issue with. But I believe it was it dependency disorder?
Dependent personality disorder, which apparently means that a person gets some sort of trauma or gets upset in an unusual way if they get separated from a particular person that they're close to.
Okay. So she said that she based that on his relationship with his wife, Kathy Allen. And this is what I'm reading, just going through some basic information online, is a personality disorder that's considered in the cluster C of personality disorders, which can have to do with different anxieties. So this is when you are, so close with someone that you are dependent on them. And if you are removed from their presence, you have a lot of traumatic responses there. So, one thing with Wawa that I think was, and we'll get more into how things went later, but, I think a lot of Rosie's criticisms were interesting, but I was looking at it through the lens of, is anything affecting Allen specifically, or these maybe issues with the overall way we treat mentally ill or potentially mentally ill people in prison systems? Like, basically like what's unusual here versus what is just kind of bad news for everybody. Does that make sense? So
that makes sense.
And also what's bad news for everybody, but maybe it's affected Richard Allen worse because he's here, not a jail. When I was looking at that from the phone angle, I was thinking, well, perhaps if he was in a jail, his phones would be also being listened to. So like that's not really that much of a change versus the prison. But with something like mental health resources, we've heard things like Cass County Jail does not have any sort of extensive mental health program or team. It's much more on a sort of occasional basis. So something like Westville has more, but then there's maybe drawbacks like the sense of isolation from Suicide Watch.
Yes.
In a maximum security cell.
Yeah, and also these so-called companions who are watching a person to make sure there's no self-harm. They're supposed to follow certain rules. For one thing, they're not supposed to talk to the inmate about their case, and certainly not supposed to share any info that they get with other inmates. But some of these inmate companions for Richard Allen broke those rules, got information from Richard Allen about his case, shared it with other inmates, and called family members as well, allegedly. Rosie at one point said, well, is it accurate to say you can't trust the companions because of their backgrounds? End quote.
That was kind of rich coming from like someone
defense attorney.
Yeah, I know. Oh, these felons, how dare they? But I mean, I got what he was saying. At the same time, he was emphasizing that some of the inmates in these companion programs, they're in jail for they're in prison for things like fraud or theft, crimes of dishonesty, crimes where somebody is essentially doing something dishonest or lying. So can we really trust them to do this?
Got still more details about therapy in prison. When Richard Allen got his therapy outside of his cell, it was in a special cage, which was roughly 3 feet by 3 feet, and it was in the shape of a triangle. Dr. Wawa indicated she never did any therapeutic testing on Richard Allen. That was usually, I guess, not the sort of thing that happens at Westville. But she did give him handouts about depression and anxiety. She gave him a book called Man's Search for Meaning. She, I think, gave him crossword puzzles, and she also gave him colored pencils and crayons.
Yes. One bizarre incident happened in March 2023 when a forensic psychologist from the state police, I guess, was sniffing around, named Dr. R. Goldenberg, and wanting to...
Yeah, when that was first brought up...
What was that?
That was first brought up. It was brought up in a confusing way.
I did not understand what was going on for a minute. I was like, wait, who?
So it was basically what it is, what it came out to be, was this doctor from the Indiana State Police apparently wanted to talk to Dr. Wawa about Richard Allen. And Dr. Wawa was told, well, you can only do that if Richard Allen gives his permission. Richard Allen didn't give his permission, so the conversation never happened.
Also, Dr. Wawa indicated that she told him, I don't think it's a good idea for you to give me permission to do this. So she was negative about it too. Basically, this is not what we should do most likely. So it sounds like they were in agreement there, but she did check with him.
One thing that they ended up making a big deal about was that during the sessions that Dr. Wawa has with her patients, sometimes she takes notes, and then subsequently she might type up those notes and enters them into the system. And then after she does that, she shreds the notes she took originally. And so Rosie tried to make a big deal about that because, aren't the notes you took originally, aren't they the best evidence? And now they're lost forever. But she said, well, I didn't want to have like an extra copy of the notes. And basically I was just typing the notes up and entering them in the system.
That seemed like such
secure.
a non-issue. I was surprised that he made such a big deal of it. That was one of his weaker points in this whole setting, because it was like, it seems like it would also be a huge issue to have a bunch of loose notes floating around a prison where, you know, people can get a hold of them, and maybe that's not so good. What are you going to do with all those papers? Also, Dr. Wawa indicated that is just business as usual. He tried to make a sort of like, well, that's against the guidelines and best practices of the profession argument there, but I guess I just did not find that super compelling.
It's probably a completely different kettle of fish. I'm not a doctor. I know we have a close relative who is a doctor who could probably tell me I'm completely confused here. But I know oftentimes if I go to see a specialist, I see them have a little notepad out and they'll take notes, and then they will type those notes up. And then later I might see a typewritten copy of those on my computer system. And so that just seems like the normal thing to do. And then why would you keep a physical copy floating around?
Yeah, it just seemed like if it has the same information, then who honestly cares? One other thing that came out is that actually Dr. Wawa does not work technically for Westville. I know I said that in the beginning. She's working at Westville, but she technically works for a third-party contractor called, was it Interion or Centurion? Centurion. They switch subcontractors every few years, but essentially it is a medical firm that services prisons like Westville. So she's technically working there. They have their own set of rules, practices, things like that could be considered a little bit separate from Westville.
At this point, they started talking about Richard Allen's health at certain points. And so I think I'll just read through some of these. And then if you think any are worth further discussion, we can discuss them. In March of 2023, according to Dr. Wawa, Richard Allen said he was not feeling right and he was struggling with stuff in his brain. On April 4th, 2023, his mental health, in her judgment, was poor and deteriorating. He was having delusions and fantasies. He thought death would bring relief, also struggling with self-esteem. On April 12th, he was banging his head on the wall and exhibiting bizarre behavior. On April 13th, had a grave disability. Also on April 13th, he was consuming his own feces. On April 21st, Dr. Wawa expressed the concern that Richard Allen might be incompetent to stand trial because his thoughts were disjointed and he was saying bizarre things. On May 3rd, 2023, he said he wanted to confess to the crime and actually began discussing the details of how he did the crime. On May 17th, 2023, he exhibited an increase in his disorganized thinking and paranoia. And it wasn't until July 11th of 2023 that she saw some signs his mental health was being restored.
Yes. So he started off again good, and then he became sort of a critical case around this time. And she noticed things like his eyes would often be bulging out of his head. And at times, though, she talked about that she thought that he might be faking symptoms. At times. At other times, they thought maybe he has some sort of temporary psychotic disorder. Again, some of those symptoms line up with things like psychosis, but other things he'd be claiming to like have memory loss and then be saying things that indicated that he did not have memory loss. So you had a level of deception that the experts were perhaps noticing, or at least possible deception, where they're looking at that and saying, is this guy suffering from something real, or is he play acting to have a desired outcome?
Yes.
And yeah, so that was a lot of it. I'll note this one thing, just speaking of Richard Allen's sort of demeanor and health. I always watch him at these hearings, and I never really, we can't know what's in his head. We can't know what's in anyone's head unless they're telling us. But in his case, he can't tell us. He's not gonna testify. He's not gonna get up and talk about what's going on here. But, I've noticed in these last two hearings, like there has been like kind of he will like stare out at the crowd and glower at people. I locked eyes with him. I held his stare. He's like, he's scowling. And I don't know again whether that is him squinting and just looking upset and he's not really feeling that way, or if he's trying to stare people down, but it's very unsettling. And I noticed at one point, I don't know whether he was looking directly at Liberty's family, who is in sort of the front row of the opposite side of the courtroom of us. But he seemed to be glaring their way. That's what it looked like to me from my angle. Again, maybe that was not intended as sort of an angry, intimidating stare, but I think that is how it looked from the outside. So you have this guy who continues to be sort of staring down people in this setting. It's off-putting. It's very odd. His sort of head is shaved, his sort of beard is shaved. He looks a bit different, but he looks like he's lost weight, but not as concerning as he once looked. He's dressed in an orange jumpsuit from the Cass County Jail. And I think I saw him smile once during this whole thing. He seemed to be listening to something that a deputy, and I think somebody who I believe to be defense investigator Matt Hoffman we're talking about behind him. He seemed to be sort of smiling and nodding along. But for the most part, he either looks dazed or angry.
I would agree with that.
And again, it's like this eye-bulging, bizarre, angry look that he just hits everyone with, and it's odd. I wonder what a jury will make of that. Because you wonder, is this a man who's angry because he feels like he's being gawked at and he's wrongfully accused and whatnot? Or is this possibly the last thing that Abby and Libby saw?
Yeah, that's horrifying. There was some extended discussion about whether or not Richard Allen should have been classified with serious mental illness or SMI. And if he was classified that way, he shouldn't have been kept in solitary confinement for over 30 days, even though there are some lawsuits. even though there are some exceptions to that, but it was noted that he didn't even qualify to be classified that way because he was in there for his own safety. He's what they call a safekeeper.
And I also will note that there was a lot of discussion of like the DSM-4 versus the DSM-5 here, and people who were in the audience with us and sort of looking it up. And actually, Dr. Wawa at one point indicated that Rosie did not have updated information about what the DSM currently says and seemed to be confused on a few matters around that, so may have gotten some of that information wrong. It's possible that it was accurate more at the time of what he's talking about, but it's not clear to me that he was sort of right when he was talking about what should be diagnosed or what should be labeled as a serious mental disorder.
Then we had the break, and after the break, Brad Rosie started talking about Dr. Walla's activities on social media.
So let me just set this up. For the past, however long this questioning went on for, Dr. Wawa in some ways is a very useful witness for the defense because she's talking about how hard life is in Westville. Regardless of how you feel about Richard Allen and his guilt or innocence, you have to admit that going from a normal life where you're a CVS, sort of in a managerial role with a family and living on the outside to suddenly suicide watch, isolation on this sort of restricted housing unit in Westville, a really tough prison where people are yelling at you and calling you baby killer. That is a huge and traumatic shift. There's no denying that. So Wallace speaks to that, and I felt she often spoke of Richard Allen with a real profound sympathy. I felt like this was a woman, as the defense sort of led her through these questions, these very kind of friendly questions in the beginning, she is talking about sort of how she and others at the prison really tried to go above and beyond to treat him, to help him acclimate, and to talk to him. And so I felt like that's where we started, and then we come back from break. It's a totally different circus.
Because now he's talking about her following social media about the case, and the implication is this is very wrong. And so it comes out that Dr. Wawa has listened to podcasts that cover the Delphi murders. She's followed the case on Facebook. She was so interested in the Delphi murders that a year before Richard Allen was arrested, Dr. Wawa and her boyfriend made a special trip to Delphi to visit the Monon High Bridge. She followed the case even more intently after the arrest of Kegan Kline, and still more intently after Richard Allen was arrested. It was noted that she regularly listens to true crime podcasts on her commute to work, which is a 90-minute commute. And this was interesting. There is a case management system that she can access through her work called Insight. And she used that case management system to access information on Kegan Kline. And particularly, she accessed his pre-sentence report, which was full of all sorts of personal information about Kegan Kline that was by no means intended for the public to see. And she did not access this for any professional reasons. It was entirely to satisfy her own curiosity, and so almost certainly was a violation of policy.
That really shocked me. I was really surprised by that. And I just, for if anyone's curious, I'm sure you're all wondering, were we one of the podcasts listed? Well, there were no podcasts listed at this hearing, but they did enter into evidence a screenshot of her explaining what her preferred podcasts and YouTube channels are, and we were not on that list.
But what is interesting that she also, during the course of her treatment of Richard Allen, she spoke to him about the fact that she followed the case on social media, and she made a point of telling Richard Allen that he had supporters out there. She doesn't believe any of this violated any policies. She felt that she was able to compartmentalize the information she got from the podcast from how she performed her treatment of Richard Allen.
Yeah, to give you a sense, it's like he would be expressing despair about life, and she would be telling him, no, don't give up. There are so many people online who are rooting for you, who support you, who are bolstering your cause. And so she's almost like feeding him information from the social media churn to make him feel like he can kind of keep fighting. It almost sounded like she's almost acting as an internet like a cheerleader from him, who's like taking that from the internet and bringing into her real life practice. So she's actually literally saying like, no, this is what people are saying. They're on your side. That was really fascinating to me because we've often covered the case from the lens of how is the social media world impacting the case. And frankly, it may be my least favorite angle because it makes me feel like blah, like I don't want to get into this. Like it's so often just nonsense. But I think it's important to cover. That's the reason why we do it, because the internet has had an impact on this case. People's obsessiveness and obsessions have had an impact on this case. And nowhere was that more clear than when we have the accused psychologist turns out to have been involved in this community to a certain extent, was even bringing it into her practice by letting Richard Allen know about it.
A prosecutor, Stacey Diener, objected, saying the defense was trying to discredit Dr. Wawa for the way she was doing business, but that this in no way had any connection to whether or not the statements that Richard Allen made to her were voluntary or whether or not they should be admitted.
Yeah, I'd be curious, what is your take on this? Because I'm of several minds of this, and I think maybe what I would prefer to do is I'll kind of share my opinions now. Maybe you can share some, but I want to have the caveat is I want to talk to some mental health experts as well and get their take on it, and talk to some folks who maybe are mental health experts who have testified in cases, just to kind of get more of a sense there of what people are saying, because I guess I just see it through a few different lenses. I have nuanced takes on this.
My take is what's at issue is the statements he made that were confessions or incriminating statements. So let's draw a circle around those and let's look at the circumstances in which those statements were made. And if there's a trouble there, if there's a problem there, maybe we can throw them out. If not, we don't have to do an entire x-ray of Dr. Walla's entire career and her entire social media profile.
I concur with you strongly. Now, just as a layperson, it does make me somewhat uncomfortable. I hope that this is for folks who are into true crime and may have jobs that touch upon sensitive issues, maybe keeping in mind, because one thing Wallace said was that while she didn't feel like she violated any policies, she would have done it differently if she could do it again. So maybe this is a reminder that you will, if you do something that's even close to the line, you will get raked over the coals by defense attorneys later on, or the prosecution, who knows. And that's good to keep in mind. And does it make me somewhat uncomfortable, someone following the case and then being directly involved in it this way? If I'm being honest, it does make me somewhat uncomfortable. I'm sure it sounded like she was very much trying to support him in terms of giving him hope about some of this stuff. But I also kind of feel like, I don't know, that seems like getting so interested in the case and then being directly involved. I could totally see why the defense has some pretty serious issues with this. So I can kind of see both sides. But do I think it impacts the confessions? No. And here's why. There's nothing in there to indicate that she's just making stuff up to have him say something. I mean, again and again. I mean, also, let me just be so blunt. Let me be blunt. We talked about the mountain of evidence that Harshman referenced. I mean, they could throw all this to the curb and they still have dozens of other confessions, including other ones containing specific information about the crime. So I don't know how much this ultimately matters. I can see why the defense wants it out. I think that is a reasonable request for them. But I also don't necessarily see that Dr. Monica Wawa is tainted to that extent. Based on what we heard today, what do you think?
I agree. I agree completely.
And I don't want to sound too harsh. I mean, people can be interested in crime. One thing I will say in Dr. Walla's defense is that the only post they shared was her saying, "Oh, I listen to these people. These are my favorite YouTubers or whatnot." There's nothing of her going around and saying, "I think Richard Allen is guilty as sin. I hope he goes to hell." Like, there's nothing like that in terms of opinions on the actual facts of the case, or leaking information about her patient, or going out and telling people, "Yes, he's my patient. Here's what he's saying." So, I mean, It's definitely concerning, but there was nothing really truly egregious about what she was actually doing other than being aware of the case. And one might argue that in this informational environment where we're in kind of a post-newspaper, a lot of people get their news through things like podcasts, through things like Facebook communities. You can say that's good or bad, but ultimately, I don't think in the past you would have raked a psychologist over the coals for reading a local newspaper, even if that local newspaper was doing a lot of detailed coverage of a crime. You wouldn't. You just wouldn't. But with this, there's more of a hyper specification. I do get that. I don't necessarily think this is going to be a huge deal. At first, I was like, oh, geez, wow, that sounds really bad. Then as I kind of listened more to the details of what was actually done, I was like, yeah, I see both sides to a certain extent.
So the cross-examination was done by Stacy Diener, a member of the team of prosecutor Nick McClellan. She had a terrific day today. I'll just quickly go through some of her the points she made. She brought out from Dr. Waller the fact that if there was something in her written notes, she would then enter it into the system. So nothing was really being lost, as we indicated. She was basically just creating a secure copy of it. She also got Dr. Waller to discuss that she wasn't there to talk to Richard Allen about the case. She was just there to help him cope with mental health issues. So it wasn't like any social media stuff was really polluting how she was handling the case. She wasn't interrogating him and trying to get him to spill the beans, so to speak.
In fact, in one notable occurrence, she was actually trying to get him to stop talking just as much as his wife and mother were trying to get that to happen. That was in a situation where he asked her to help him reach out to his wife. Do you want to talk about this now, or do you have something else?
A little bit later.
Okay. I'll save that, but that's coming up.
We then got a little bit more context on some of the mental health issues and stuff that had been brought up earlier in the direct examination from Brad Rosie. Let me just quickly go through some of these. In April of 2023, Richard Allen's thought process and speech became disorganized. This occurred just after he'd had visits from his attorneys. And so Dr. Waller wondered if the visit from the attorneys could have been a trigger for this bizarre behavior. So that is
striking.
That is interesting. Richard Allen, as we mentioned, indicated he found God during his incarceration. And Dr. Waller mentioned that whenever she talked with Richard Allen, she would not begin by asking about the crime. She would just make vague statements like, how are you doing? What's on your mind? And then she would follow his lead. And it got to the point where his lead often took them to the crime. And it was suggested that there was a connection between Richard Allen finding God and deciding that he wanted to confess. And when this was mentioned, I looked at Richard Allen. For whatever it may be worth, it may not be worth much. He was shaking his head at that point.
He was often shaking his head and then at times nodding his head. He definitely was moving around a lot. Not a lot of expression other than going between angry and wide-eyed, in my view. But definitely a lot of head movement.
There was a lot of concern from Dr. Waller that he was faking his bizarre behavior. He indicated at one point in May of 2023 that people were telling him to kill himself, but he was too much of a coward to kill himself.
He was going to kill himself by standing on top of a sink, I believe, and like jumping off. I don't know. It was a bit confusing. They kind of bounced around from here and there.
Okay, I think this is the point where you were referring to where Richard Allen asked for help from Dr. Waller to reach his wife.
So he does this. She complies. At that point, he had smashed his tablet, so she needed to get him a cordless phone and then helped him dial his wife. And then I believe left the room for some privacy. Comes back in. He says, can you redial it? And she does. And he says at that time, stay here. I want you to hear this.
Yes.
Essentially, I want you to hear my confession to my wife.
So that you understand.
So that you understand. And then he proceeds to confess to his wife on the phone while Dr. Wawa is there.
And again, we know how that confession went over. And Richard Allen apparently told Dr. Wawa that he was in a place where he was being forced to choose between God and his family, and he could not choose God over his family.
Right.
Because his family, again, did not want him to confess and accept the consequences for his actions.
Presumably God would want him to take accountability for what he did, what he says he did to those kids, and to be honest and truthful. But, you know, what started perhaps as an attempt to ensure that he would enter heaven with his family and be reunited with his loved ones, ultimately, after taking accountability, then became an either-or thing, because his family essentially shunned him to a certain extent until he complied with what they wanted, which was to fight and to try to get free and to not confess anymore.
I think that's all I wanted to say about Dr. Wawa. Were there more things you wanted to say before we move on?
I would just say that I feel like Brad Rosie did a good job. He's very aggressive. He really ripped her apart on the stand in an effort to impeach her. I don't know how ultimately successful that will be, given that I don't necessarily think that her actions, when you look at them closely, actually align with what he's saying. Although, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that this could be looked upon badly for her in terms of her, conduct. I really, she indicated that there's not been any repercussions for her at Westville. So it's possible that this was looked at as a person who is too interested in this case and maybe made some mistakes, but ultimately really didn't do anything egregious. And I think if she was not sharing information about him with others online, I don't necessarily see this as a huge deal. But I think Rosie did a good job. He was animated. He was energetic. If it had ended there, I would have said he had some of the best moments, even though he definitely floundered a bit. He had some floundering, but he also had some really, zingers and whatnot. I just think that everything that came after, it honestly, it felt like a microcosm of the cycle of this case, because it's like, the defense comes out with something just wild, and then like 2 minutes later, facts come out that end up kind of overshadowing that. So it was sort of interested to see that boil down into a single hearing.
So let's go all the way back to the beginning and cover the least interesting parts of the day. No disrespect to the witnesses. I'm going to fly through this. If I go too fast, or if there's things that you think I'm missing, please stop me.
It was very repetitive, Kevin.
It was very, very boring.
It was very boring.
I'm going to be
very
blunt.
repetitive.
It was really, really boring.
I just felt it was like day one Redux, where we're getting nothing new, which is all the stuff from the filings a billion times more.
I will say that usually I don't mention things on the podcast that either I don't witness or Anya did witness. But someone, and I apologize to this person because I don't remember who it was. It's been a long, long day. But someone says they overheard Baldwin go up to Kathy Allen before court began today and told her, just so you know, there's going to be some bad stuff coming out today.
Yes.
And there was.
There definitely was. That was correct.
So when the court session began, there was a bit of a surprise because, as I said, all these motions were about whether or not the confessions would be admitted into the trial. But I'm sure all of you are saying, well, what about the other motion that you said was going to be heard today? And this was the motion the defense filed to suppress the statements that Richard Allen made in his second interview with the police. This was the interview that was conducted by Lieutenant Jerry Holman. And at the beginning of court today, Brad Rosie announced they were withdrawing that.
I was surprised by that because they made a really big deal about it, about how, he was interrogated and he was in custody and Jerry Holman was, a big guy and scared him a lot because he's a little guy, and then that went nowhere. So I think one person sitting next to me indicated like that must have been a press release. And I that's what the feeling I got was that this was essentially something they wanted to put out there to attack law enforcement, to kind of go on the offensive. But then when it came to the actual legality of it, it was pretty obvious that it was not a custodial situation. He was there voluntarily, and therefore there was very little that could be done based on that. It was a weak legal argument. So I think it was probably, you don't want to see them doing that. I'd rather things be more like by the book. But I also, I think it's probably better to withdraw that than to kind of carry it out.
And speaking of custodial interrogation, Stacey Diener, at the beginning, before any testimony was heard today, she said this other motion is a complete waste of time because the defense is asking for every single confession to be thrown out because they say all of them were done in custodial interrogation situations where like state actors, or the situation was like coercing or inducing Richard Allen to make confessions, so they should all be thrown out. And she said, no, these weren't interrogation situations. They don't meet the definition of interrogation. Nobody was interrogating him. And you can't be so general. If you have a problem with like one or two specific confessions, we can look at the circumstances around them and make a decision. But this is just too broad. It's not specific enough for us to respond to. It's kind of a waste of time.
Can I have a little bit of a non sequitur here? Because I feel like Diener was completely on the money here. I mean, I complimented some of what Rosie did today, but this whole thing was completely overly broad and to a ridiculous degree. I think based on what the actual law says, Gull would have been well within her rights to throw this out. I don't think she would have, because I think that she wants to establish that she's going to hear them out and is going to essentially move forward with a clean slate for this defense team. And let me just say this, over the past 2 days, we really have seen a clean slate. I think in fairness, from both the judge and the defense. I don't want to act like, this is a new dawn for everyone, but I felt like the defense has been a lot more kind of polite, not aggressive with the judge, solicitous, very much towing the line a lot more in terms of how they're engaging with things. I think the judge has been, less snarky. There's been times where, the prosecution has said, well, the defense said this, and Gull's like, no, the defense said this and they're correct. It's just interesting to see. Like, I didn't expect that because there's been so much bad blood, but I really feel like we have seen a bit of a reset, at least over the past 2 hearings.
I would agree.
And I think Judge Gull has actually done quite a good job of, listen, this one went on forever, but she's heard them out. She's letting them do their thing. She's not really putting a lot of limitations on them. I think with the couple of times when things have just gone so far afield, she has stepped in, but it just feels like it's a bit different. So, it's good to see because you want to see everyone working together and the system working. So happy to see that.
So the first witness was the former warden of Westville, whose name I always have trouble pronouncing.
It's John Gallipo.
John Gallipo. And I have several pages of notes here, but basically he said things he said before, describing the circumstances of the detention at Westville, talking about these companions outside the door. One thing that got some attention was that he was asked, is there some sort of a system where people can use to look up information about people who are in your prison? And he said, I'm not aware of such a system. And basically Rosie was fishing because he wanted the warden to talk about the Insight program, which was the program used by mental health professionals such as Dr. Wawa in order to access that kind of information. I'm not even sure the warden would have any reason to access that information.
A lot of people were intrigued by that. They're like, was the warden lying? And I get that. I think that's a reasonable question. And listen, I'd like to know more too. But I definitely felt without knowing more about what the warden does day to day and what systems they use versus what a third party contractor that does mental health uses, I'm not willing to say, oh my gosh, he perjured himself, because frankly, it's not really a good reason to perjure yourself. I mean, like, you know, if there's a system that everyone uses, they're probably going to figure that out. So I thought that there was probably either a miscommunication there or just perhaps that he doesn't use the same stuff the others do.
I've got pages of notes here. I don't really want to go through them all. I'll pick one thing out at random. It was like, oh, his bed mat is on the floor. And the warden said, well, yes, his bed mat is on the floor because when a person is on suicide watch, you don't want them to be in a position where they can hide under a bed. So there's a lot of these things that sound kind of bad. Then you get some context, and
it's like maybe life in prison is bad, not necessarily specifically for Richard Allen, but for everyone.
And
especially
also,
on suicide watch on a segregated, restricted housing ward.
And please correct me if I'm wrong, Anya, but I kind of feel like a lot of that testimony, including the detail about the mat on the floor, I'm pretty sure we heard that back in last June.
Yes, it is bad for Richard Allen in prison. The defense contends it's extra bad. The prosecution contends it's probably better than most people on that ward because he gets a lot more privileges, but he also is at times suicidal, and we kind of have to deal with that as best the prison has to deal with that as best they can.
So pages of notes, but it's basically stuff that was talked about last June. Is there anything you wanted to say about it other than what I've...
No, I think we can move on.
The next witness of the morning was, and I apologize, the morning was not good for me in witness names.
No.
It's Keneva Maps.
Keneva Maps, I believe so. She is an investigator for Westville Prison. She works as a police officer, but specifically for the prison. And she would do things like essentially investigate aspects of this. So she was part of chain of custody as far as one thing we should probably mention that I can't believe we didn't mention. But one of the things that came up was that Allen wrote a letter to Warden Gallipo saying, how did we forget that? This was like the most important thing. Our brains are fried and we do apologize. If we miss anything big, we'll try to cover it in future coverage. Just forgive us because we've literally been up and since like 4 a.m. and it's been a time. But Allen wrote a letter to Warden Gallipo saying, I would like to confess to you, apparently. And Warden Gallipo did not meet with him. He instead turned the letter over to the Westville's Internal Affairs Division and gave it to them to deal with. And that was probably a very smart move. You might be wondering, why wouldn't he just go get the confession? But that would not really be appropriate. He'd be acting as a state actor on behalf of the police.
Right. And again, I apologize because there was so much overwhelming stuff in the afternoon. I think the warden did say that at times, though, when he was like walking around the area, the unit, there were times he would talk to Allen through the door and Allen would spontaneously confess.
Yes, say that he committed the murders. So he was confessing to everyone. And it also came out that a chaplain had possibly been confessed to as well. So, I mean, this guy was telling everybody. Again, we focused on the stuff that came later because we felt that the afternoon witnesses get us a lot closer to the truth, get us a lot closer to what the evidence is against Allen. It's more interesting than relitigating the safekeeping order 1,000 times. But, you know, that's kind of how it went down. So to reiterate, I mean, are we ready to reiterate, or are there other facts that we want to have in here?
I think we're ready to reiterate.
Let's reiterate. Allen has confessed or made incriminating statements that have been...
I think over 60 times.
Over 60 times.
I think it's confessions because Harshman said over 60 confessions.
And this includes... were these... I forget. Were these entirely recorded, or were these just general and some of them are recorded?
I think they're not entirely recorded because some of them were things that were said to the suicide companions who then wrote them down and documented them.
Okay, so some are recorded and then some are documented in writing on these logs. One thing that came out was this idea that, well, did he get details wrong? Was he saying the girls were shot when they were really killed with a, sharp edge weapon? And one thing that came out was that it's possible that the suicide companions wrote things down or recounted things incorrectly later on. So you have a game of telephone going, which makes a lot of sense when you think about it. But he's made over 60 confessions. A lot of these are recorded on video and audio. He's talking to people like his wife and mother, who he's begging to still love him, even though he killed 2 kids. And they're telling him to shut up and that he doesn't know what he's talking about. And I mean, it's awful. I mean, the whole thing is just, it's horrifying. It's horrifying for everyone involved. I don't know how the families of these two kids sat through today's session, especially at the end there, because it's sickening to think about. It made me very sad. And I don't know. I think it will be very, very, very difficult for the defense to come back with anything. Even if they successfully impeach Wawa, even if they get some of these confessions knocked down, this is a wall of evidence that is going to be really hard to scale, because you can say that somebody was having a hard time in solitary confinement and lost their mind, but frankly, these attorneys haven't even made any sort of motion to declare him incompetent to stand trial, so I don't really know what their mental health argument could be at this point. They could argue that he has mental health issues, but, you know, if someone kills two kids and then gets away with it for like 6 years, then I that's a hard argument to make, because they were smart enough to not tell anyone, seemingly. And then as for other things, I mean, again, they could get some of the confessions thrown out, but we have to think about, what is a jury going to feel hearing him talk about this and possibly give details at times, details that only the killer would know? How is a jury going to walk away feeling about that, on top of the bullet, on top of him placing himself there? I can understand now, perhaps better than ever, why the defense team has taken some of the strategies that they've taken, where they're throwing mud at law enforcement, they're throwing mud at the wall, they're desperately trying to change the subject. Because the second we actually get to what Richard Allen is doing, it's devastating. He is a nightmare client, because he will not shut up, and because at one point in his time there, for a time, he was on a mission from God, essentially, to expunge his sins in his mind and tell everybody about what he did. And maybe he changed his mind since. Maybe he thinks that maybe he's been told that he needs to fight, that he needs to keep this going. But the damage is done, and it's going to be difficult. They have a tough road ahead.
And tomorrow will be interesting. And thank you all for listening, and we'll talk again tomorrow.
Thanks.
Thanks so much for listening to The Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for The Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience, as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Beat the summertime sluggishness and enhance your everyday with our wonderful sponsor, Via Hemp.
This is a company that crafts award-winning premium THC and THC-free gummies with high-quality hemp grown right here on American farms, all for an excellent value, especially for Murder Sheet listeners who get a special deal. If you're 21 or older, you can experience it for yourself and get 15% off your first order with our exclusive code MSheet at viahemp.com. That's VIIAHEMP.com.
Each of Via's gummies is crafted to give you a specific mood. Get creative, get some rest, get focused, get some pleasure. All with Via's delicious gummies.
No matter what you're looking for, Via has you covered.
Their grapefruit CBG and CBD flow state gummies help me feel energized and focused to get a lot done this summer in terms of scheduling, conducting interviews, running around after sources, and more.
You don't need a medical card to enjoy Via Hemp, and these products ship legally to all 50 states.
If you're 21 and older, head to viahemp.com and use the code MSheet to receive 15% off. That's VIIAHEMP.com and use code MSheet at checkout. After you purchase, they ask you where you heard about them. Please support our show and tell them we sent you. Enhance your everyday with Via.
Wayfair's Labor Day clearance is back, and we're bringing end-of-summer deals right to your doorstep. Now through September 3rd, score up to 70% off all things home. Get in on low prices while temperatures are still high, like up to 70% off rugs, up to 50% off bedroom furniture, up to 50% off dining furniture, and up to 60% off living room seating. And the savings don't stop there. End summer with can't-miss surprise flash deals, all with fast shipping right to your doorstep. Save big on everything you need, with every style, for every home, for every budget. Modern? Check. Classic? Check. Coastal grandma with a hint of boho glam? Check and check. Wayfair's got everything you need to make your home way more you. Shop Wayfair's Labor Day clearance now through September 3rd for up to 70% off. Because at Wayfair, new season means new savings.
Wayfair, every style, every home.